At 6:17 a.m. on February 12, 1968, a Viet Cong political cadre stepped into the open doorway of a half-damaged wooden house on the western edge of a small hamlet outside Hue in South Vietnam. The morning air was already heavy. Humidity clung to skin and fabric. The rice paddies below reflected the gray light of dawn, flat and still, broken only by narrow dirt dikes running between them like seams. The man in the doorway paused for just a moment, long enough to raise a pair of binoculars, long enough to scan the flooded fields to the south. 200 yards away, an American platoon was pinned down behind a low embankment. A machine gun, dug in near a tree line, had been firing in controlled bursts for nearly an hour. 6 men had already been hit trying to move. The platoon leader was shouting orders that went nowhere. Sound carried poorly over water. The Viet Cong officer leaned forward slightly, lips moving as he gave instructions to someone inside the building. He did not know he had 40 seconds left to live, and he did not know that the man watching him was not in the tree line, not in a house, not concealed in the jungle. The shot that would kill him would come from above, from a place no one on either side had ever marked as tactically relevant. Nearly 2 miles away, beyond the hamlet, beyond the paddies, beyond a line of palms, Staff Sergeant Raymond Kozlowski sat motionless inside a wooden rice-drying watchtower, not beside it, not beneath it, inside it. The structure was old. 4 vertical posts sunk into packed earth, horizontal slats nailed unevenly, warped by years of heat and monsoon rain. It had once been used to hang harvested rice bundles, keeping them off the ground while they dried in the air. Now it held a single man. Ray had been there since 11:42 p.m. the night before. He had not moved in over 6 hours. There was no breeze inside the tower. The air was stale, thick with dust and the sour smell of old grain. Mosquitoes buzzed constantly, drawn by heat and sweat. Ray ignored them. Swatting meant movement. Movement meant reflection. Reflection meant death. He had brought 1 canteen of water. It was already half empty. He rationed every swallow. There was no food he could eat quietly. There was no place to stretch his legs. A dented metal bucket sat behind him, pushed into a corner of the platform. His rifle, an M21, woodstock darkened with oil and humidity, rested on a sandbag he had filled himself from the paddy below. The scope was already fogging at the edges. He wiped it once with his sleeve, slowly, carefully, through a narrow gap between 2 slats, widened earlier with a knife and patience. Ray could see the hamlet clearly. He had been watching it for days. He knew which men appeared at dawn. He knew who carried radios. He knew who gave directions with their hands instead of their voices. He was not watching for riflemen. He was watching for decision-makers. Over the previous week, Viet Cong patrols had searched the area repeatedly. They had entered houses, questioned villagers, walked the dikes at night with flashlights covered in red cloth. They checked tree lines. They checked abandoned huts. They checked the jungle. They never once looked up at the drying towers scattered across the fields. To them, the towers were agriculture, not terrain. Civilian structures, background noise. They were wrong. Ray understood something they did not. He had grown up in places like this, structures no one noticed because they were too familiar, too ordinary, too boring to matter. And he understood that in war, anything that everyone ignores becomes dangerous. At 6:18 a.m., the Viet Cong officer raised his binoculars again. Ray watched him through the scope. He did not rush. He had learned long ago that patience was not waiting. It was deciding not to act until the moment mattered. He adjusted his position slightly, redistributing weight across his knees. Pain flared and settled. He ignored it. The angle was steep. Downward shots always were. He adjusted his point of aim, compensating not just for distance but for gravity behaving differently when bullets fell instead of climbed. The officer leaned forward, pointing toward the paddies. Ray exhaled halfway, held. The trigger broke clean. The shot cracked through the humid air and echoed briefly inside the wooden tower like a drumbeat. Through the scope, Ray saw the officer jerk backward, binoculars falling from his hands, as he collapsed out of sight. There was no cheer, no confirmation, no second shot. Ray simply cycled the bolt, caught the casing before it could strike wood, and waited. What would follow was not in any field manual. It was not taught in sniper school. It was not approved by any engineer. It came from farm logic, not doctrine. By the time American units moved freely through this sector weeks later, Viet Cong command structure here would be fractured. Patrol routes would change. Leaders would avoid exposure. Radio discipline would break down. Lives would be saved, not because of firepower, but because one man understood elevation, patience, and the value of structures no one thought to question. This is the story of how an idea born from agricultural life reshaped a small piece of the Vietnam War, and how the man who proved it would never be officially credited for what he did. Raymond Kozlowski did not grow up around soldiers. He grew up around livestock. He was born in 1939, outside a small farming town in northern Wisconsin, the second of 5 children on a mixed agricultural property. His father barely kept solvent. The land was flat, damp in spring, frozen hard in winter, and unforgiving year-round. The work started early, before school, before daylight. By the time Ray was 10, he knew which fences failed first after a storm, which animals needed watching at night, and which jobs no one else wanted to do. Those jobs usually fell to him. One of them involved climbing. The farm used wooden grain towers and elevated drying racks, structures meant to keep crops away from moisture and animals. They were narrow, exposed, and uncomfortable. Most of Ray's brothers hated them. The height, the isolation, the way the wind moved the boards beneath your feet. Ray didn't. He learned how to climb slowly, how to test weight before committing, how to stay still for long periods without fidgeting. He learned how to sit with nothing but sound and heat and time. Another job involved spaces most people avoided entirely: clearing storage pits, repairing enclosed bins, crawling inside dark, airless compartments to break clogs or retrieve dropped tools. Claustrophobia was a liability on a farm. Panic wasted time. Ray never panicked. He focused on the task, finished it, climbed back out. No one praised him for that. It was simply expected. Ray learned to shoot not as a sport, but as a utility. Ground pests were a constant problem: rats, birds, small animals that damaged stored feed or undermined foundations. Ammunition cost money, so shots had to count. His father handed him an old rifle and a rule: 1 shot. No misses. Ray took that seriously. He learned to wait until the animal stopped moving. He learned to judge distance without measuring. He learned that rushing ruined accuracy. By his early teens, neighbors noticed. They asked him to help when pests became a problem. Ray never charged. He didn't see it as a skill worth monetizing. It was just something he did well. He never imagined it would matter beyond the farm. When Ray graduated high school in 1957, the world beyond Wisconsin felt distant. He stayed. The farm needed labor. His father was aging. College wasn't discussed. Ray worked full-time, waking before dawn, sleeping early, repeating the same cycle day after day. When American involvement in Vietnam escalated in the early 1960s, it barely registered at first. Names of places he couldn't pronounce, newsreels that felt unreal. Then men from nearby towns started leaving. Some came back different, some didn't come back at all. By 1965, one of Ray's closest childhood friends was killed during a patrol in the Central Highlands. The letter arrived folded too neatly. The language was careful, impersonal. Ray read it once. Then again. He went back to work the same afternoon. But something shifted. Ray was not drafted. Agricultural deferments still existed, and his father depended on him. Staying home would have been easy, acceptable, expected. Ray did not feel right about it. In early 1966, after months of saying nothing, he drove into town alone and enlisted. His father did not argue. He did not approve either. They shook hands. That was it. Basic training exposed Ray's first real difference. Marksmanship instructors noticed immediately. Tight groups, consistent results, no wasted rounds. When asked where he learned, Ray said, "On a farm." They sent him for additional evaluation. He was quiet, unassuming, uninterested in competition, but he listened. He absorbed instruction. He adjusted quickly. At sniper training, Ray did well, not because he was flashy, but because he was patient. He didn't rush shots. He didn't chase targets. He waited for conditions to align: wind, angle, movement, things he had learned without names. By late 1967, Ray was deployed to Vietnam as a designated marksman, attached to an infantry unit operating near Hue. He arrived with no illusions. He understood terrain. He understood fatigue. He understood that comfort was temporary. What he did not yet understand was how much the war would resemble the farm, not in appearance but in rhythm, waiting, watching, knowing when not to act. That realization would come soon enough. Ray's unit entered the area west of Hue in late January 1968, just days after the opening phase of the Tet Offensive. The fighting there did not look like the war shown on maps. There were no clear front lines, no defined objectives marked by flags, just villages, paddies, tree lines, and narrow dirt roads that all looked the same until someone started shooting. The enemy did not hold ground. They occupied moments. Viet Cong patrols moved along predictable routes at predictable hours, not because they were careless, but because control required visibility. Someone had to step forward, someone had to signal, someone had to speak into a radio. That someone usually did not survive long. The first man Ray saw die was Private First Class Daniel Morris, a radio operator from Ohio. At 8:41 a.m., Morris rose just high enough behind a paddy dike to extend his antenna. A single shot cracked from somewhere ahead. Morris dropped backward into the water. The bullet entered below the ear. Exit wound was clean. No one saw the shooter. At 10:12 a.m., Sergeant Paul Hanley was hit while crossing a narrow causeway between paddies. One round, center mass. Hanley had been mid-sentence. By midday, the platoon had stopped advancing altogether. They were being selected, not suppressed. Ray studied the pattern. Shots did not come from the jungle. They came downward. He traced angles after every casualty, crouching where the men had fallen, following imaginary lines back toward likely firing points. The enemy was using elevation, not trees, too obvious, not rooftops, too fragile. They used civilian height, raised houses, second-story windows, small platforms built for drying crops or storing tools, places Americans avoided firing on unless absolutely certain. American doctrine struggled here. Artillery was limited. Villages were full of civilians. Air support was unpredictable and often denied. Tanks, where available, could not elevate their guns sufficiently to counter high-angle fire. Infantry advanced at ground level, blind to threats above them, and the enemy knew it. On February 4th, a patrol from Ray's company lost 3 men in under 15 minutes. First, the point man, then the squad leader, then the replacement radio operator. Each shot was deliberate, each target chosen. Ray recognized the method immediately. This was not harassment fire. This was command disruption. The enemy was not trying to win firefights. They were trying to remove leadership. At 2:26 p.m. that afternoon, Lieutenant Andrew Keller stepped into the open doorway of a house to direct movement across a flooded field. Ray was 20 yards away when Keller was hit. The bullet snapped his head sideways. He fell without a sound. Ray did not fire back. He couldn't. There was no visible shooter, no muzzle flash, no sound to triangulate. The shot had come from somewhere elevated, concealed, and already abandoned. professional, disciplined. That night, Ray lay awake listening to insects and distant gunfire. He replayed the day repeatedly. The enemy was using terrain correctly. The Americans were reacting instead of anticipating. Over the next week, losses continued. Names blurred together, but the pattern did not. Men who spoke died first. Men who pointed died second. Men who followed orders died last. The platoons adapted by moving slower, speaking less, hugging cover. It helped, but it did not solve the problem. Ray walked the area at dawn whenever he could. He studied the land the way he had studied fields back home, not for beauty but for function. Rice paddies formed natural channels. Dikes created predictable movement. Villages sat on slightly raised ground, and scattered among them were structures no one discussed. Drying towers, raised racks, simple wooden frames that blended into daily life. They were everywhere, and they were all ignored. Ray stopped at one just after sunrise on February 9th. It stood at the edge of a paddy, weathered, partially collapsed, no signs of recent use. He climbed it slowly. From the top platform, the view changed everything. Routes became visible. Lines of movement revealed themselves. Buildings used by enemy cadres stood out clearly. From ground level, the war was chaos. From above, it had structure. Ray climbed down and said nothing. That night, another man died. At 7:18 p.m., Corporal Luis Ramirez was shot while distributing ammunition. One round, chest. Ray sat with the body until evacuation arrived. He felt no rage, just certainty. The enemy was not better trained. They were simply positioned correctly, and position was something Ray understood. By the time Ray made his decision, it did not feel like innovation. It felt like correction. If elevation was killing Americans, then elevation would be used to stop it. Not from obvious places, not from doctrine-approved positions, but from places that had always been there, waiting for someone who understood what they were. Ray began preparing 3 days before he ever climbed the tower. He did not think of preparation as planning. Planning implied flexibility. What he was doing required certainty. Every variable he failed to account for would show itself later as pain, noise, or exposure. On the morning of February 8, 1968, he moved alone through the rice paddies west of Hue, keeping his rifle slung and his posture deliberately casual. From a distance, he looked like another infantryman cutting across open ground. Up close, his movement was slow, deliberate, and unnecessary for anyone with a schedule. He stopped often, not to rest, but to look. Rice-drying towers dotted the fields irregularly. Some were no more than crude wooden frames. Others were taller, reinforced with crossbeams, their platforms raised well above head height to keep harvested rice out of floodwater and away from animals. Most had been abandoned after recent fighting disrupted the harvest. Ray examined them one by one. The first tower he climbed creaked immediately. The sound was sharp and repeated, the kind of noise that traveled. He climbed down without reaching the platform. The second tower had fresh rope marks along one support beam. Someone had used it recently. That meant eyes were familiar with it. He dismissed it without climbing. The third tower offered good height but stood too close to a footpath. Villagers still moved through the area daily, even with fighting nearby. Regular traffic meant attention. Attention meant questions. He marked nothing. He carried no map. Everything stayed in his head. By early afternoon, he reached the fourth tower. It stood alone near an overgrown section of paddy that had not been replanted after earlier shelling. The ground beneath it was uneven, partially collapsed where water had pooled for weeks. No footprints, no signs of recent use. One rung of the ladder was missing entirely, forcing a climber to step wide and commit weight carefully. Ray smiled briefly. Neglect like this discouraged curiosity. He climbed halfway up and stopped, letting the structure settle under his weight. The wood flexed, then went still. No secondary noise, no echoing creak. He continued. At the top platform he did not stand. He crouched, placing his weight low, distributing pressure evenly across the boards. He waited nearly 10 minutes before moving again. Inside, the space was smaller than he expected. The interior had been enclosed years earlier with uneven slats, leaving narrow vertical gaps where boards had warped. Light filtered through those gaps in thin lines. Dust hung in the air, unmoving. Ray sat with his back against one support post and listened. The tower moved when the wind pushed from the south, a faint sway, barely perceptible, but enough to change balance if he shifted too quickly. He rocked his weight once, slowly, then stopped. The structure responded predictably. That mattered. A structure that behaved consistently could be worked with. An unpredictable one could not. He noted which boards creaked under pressure and which remained silent. He ran his fingers along nail heads, memorizing their locations so he would not brush against them later. After nearly an hour, he climbed down. He returned again at dusk. Light changed everything. Shadows deepened. Gaps that looked invisible at noon became sharp lines of contrast in low sun. From outside, the tower looked exactly like every other abandoned structure in the field. Ray watched it from a distance for 20 minutes. No one looked at it. That night, back at the perimeter, Ray cleaned his rifle carefully and laid out his gear. He removed anything that could reflect light or make noise. He wrapped his canteen in cloth to prevent condensation from dripping. He counted his ammunition twice and removed more than he thought he would need. Excess rounds meant weight. Weight meant fatigue. Fatigue caused mistakes. He brought a single ration bar and broke it in half before packing it. He would eat only if his hands began to shake. The bucket went in last. Experience told him that discomfort became dangerous when it turned into urgency. He had no intention of climbing down because his body forced him to. On the night of February 11th, he left friendly lines just before midnight. No one asked where he was going. Snipers and marksmen moved independently, often enough that it raised no questions. The walk to the tower took longer than expected. Waterlogged ground pulled at his boots. Twice he stopped completely when he heard voices moving along a distant dike. He stood still long enough that insects crawled across his face and neck. He did not brush them away. When he reached the tower, it was darker than he remembered. Cloud cover had thickened. The structure blended into the night almost completely. The climb was slow. He tested each rung before committing weight. When he reached the missing rung, he paused, adjusted his grip, and stepped wide. The wood held. At the top, he froze. He waited. Nothing. Inside the tower, the air was already warm and stale. The smell of old rice and rot clung to everything. Ray settled into position facing northeast, not because it offered the widest view, but because it offered the least expected one. Most attention in the area focused south and west, toward American movement. From here, Ray could observe lateral traffic and command behavior without looking directly into the most watched sectors. He eased his rifle forward and rested it against a sandbag he had filled earlier that day and carried up strapped to his pack. The angle downward was severe. He adjusted his posture carefully, experimenting with knee placement until the rifle rested naturally without muscle tension. He checked his watch once, 11:42 p.m. He did not check it again for hours. The night passed slowly. His legs went numb first, then pain replaced numbness, then numbness returned. He shifted weight by fractions of an inch, never enough to make the tower respond. Sleep came in flashes measured in seconds. Each time his head dipped, he caught himself and corrected. At 4:30 a.m., the sky began to lighten almost imperceptibly. Shapes emerged. At 5:15, movement began in the hamlet. Ray did not fire. He watched men emerge, cross open ground, disappear again. Riflemen, couriers, replaceable roles. He memorized patterns. At 6:17 a.m., a political cadre stepped into the open doorway of a damaged house. Ray had seen him before. He watched the man raise binoculars, watched his posture, watched the way others waited for his gestures before moving. Ray adjusted his aim slightly, compensating for the steep downward angle and minimal wind. He exhaled halfway. The shot echoed violently inside the tower, a sharp concussion that rang in his ears and vibrated through the wood beneath him. He ignored it. Through the scope, he saw the man collapse backward out of sight. Ray cycled the bolt and caught the casing before it struck the floor. Then he waited. Ray did not move after the first shot. He stayed exactly where he was, breathing shallowly, letting the structure absorb the sound and return to stillness. His ears rang a high, dull tone that flattened everything else for several minutes. He accepted it as part of the cost. Inside the tower, sound had nowhere to go. Below, the hamlet reacted. Men ran without direction. Voices rose then fell. Someone shouted an order that was immediately contradicted by another. Ray watched all of it through the scope without touching the trigger. The worst mistake he could make now was impatience. One shot created uncertainty. 2 shots too quickly would create focus. He waited. At 6:41 a.m., 2 men carried the body inside the building. No medic followed. Ray noted that detail. Leadership deaths traveled faster than injuries. At 7:03 a.m., a small group gathered behind a wall near the center of the hamlet. One man held a radio handset. He was not speaking into it yet, only listening, head tilted slightly as if trying to make sense of fragmented instructions. Ray adjusted the rifle a fraction of an inch. Distance was just under 900 yards. Wind was negligible. Angle remained steep. He waited until the man stepped clear of the wall. The second shot came almost an hour after the first. The man with the radio dropped where he stood. The handset fell free and bounced once before settling in the dirt. Ray caught the casing again and settled back into position. Inside the tower, the smell of burned powder mixed with rot and dust. It was unpleasant but familiar. He wiped sweat from his eyes with the back of his wrist, careful not to touch the wood. Below, movement slowed. Runners replaced radios. Orders were repeated. Men hesitated before crossing open ground. Ray noted the change with quiet satisfaction. At 8:22 a.m., patrols began searching outward. They moved along the dikes first, scanning tree lines, pausing at huts, pointing and whispering. Ray followed them through the scope, tracking their progress without urgency. They were doing exactly what doctrine taught them to do. They were looking where danger usually came from. At 9:10 a.m., one patrol stopped directly beneath the tower. Ray felt his pulse spike for the first time. 4 men stood in the shade, smoking, talking quietly. One leaned against a support post and knocked ash from his cigarette with a finger. Ray did not move. The tower did not respond. After several minutes, the men moved on. Ray exhaled slowly. By late morning, the heat inside the tower had become oppressive. Sweat soaked his uniform completely. His knees throbbed constantly, a deep, aching pressure that never fully receded. He adjusted his weight slightly, feeling the wood flex and then settle. He did not drink. Water was insurance. It was not to be used until absolutely necessary. At 10:47 a.m., a new figure appeared near the same building where the first cadre had been shot. This one moved differently, faster, more cautious. He stayed in shadow, speaking briefly to others before retreating again. Ray recognized the behavior. Interim leadership. He waited nearly 15 minutes watching the man step out. Retreat. Step out again. Eventually, the man grew confident enough to cross a small, open section of ground. Ray fired. The third body fell just as unceremoniously as the others. This time, the reaction was immediate and sharp. Men scattered without coordination. Someone fired blindly toward the American lines. Another man dropped to his knees and crawled backward into cover. Ray did not fire again. By noon, organized movement in the hamlet had largely stopped. The war quieted in a way Ray recognized. Not peace, but confusion. Orders were not reaching the right people at the right time. Units moved only when necessary and only under cover. Ray took his first sip of water at 12:14 p.m. He forced himself to stop after 2 swallows. At 12:58 p.m., a small group gathered near a tree line west of the hamlet. One man carried papers tucked under his arm, moving with a stiffness Ray had seen before. Officers who did not expect to be exposed walked differently. Ray adjusted his aim. The shot struck the man in the chest. He fell forward, papers scattering across the dirt. Ray did not watch what happened next. He shifted his gaze immediately, scanning for reaction rather than confirmation. By early afternoon, Ray's hands began to tremble slightly when he cycled the bolt. Not fear, fatigue. He slowed himself deliberately, forcing each movement to take twice as long as necessary. At 2:11 p.m., a runner emerged from a rear building carrying a radio battery. He stopped briefly to adjust the strap. Ray let him go. Replaceable. At 3:02 p.m., a man stepped into a doorway and began gesturing sharply, clearly frustrated. Others gathered around him. Ray watched for nearly 5 minutes before committing. The 5th shot of the day ended the discussion permanently. Inside the tower, Ray's ears were nearly useless now. Sound came through as vibration more than noise. He relied on sight and memory. Below, patrols became erratic. Some searched the same buildings repeatedly. Others abandoned searches entirely. One group fired sporadically into empty tree lines. No one looked up. As the sun lowered, shadows lengthened across the paddies. The light shifted, changing the contrast through the gaps in the tower walls. Ray adjusted his position by centimeters, keeping the opening in shadow, while preserving his field of view. At 5:19 p.m., the final target of the day appeared. This one moved with purpose, flanked by 2 riflemen. He crossed open ground quickly, head down, trying to minimize exposure. Ray waited until the man reached the midpoint of the paddy. Distance was just over 700 yards. The shot dropped him instantly. That was the last round Ray fired that day. As darkness approached, the hamlet went nearly silent. No fires were lit. Movement ceased entirely. Ray drank the rest of his water slowly, saving a final swallow for later. His legs were stiff to the point of pain. He did not attempt to stand. Night settled in around the tower. Wood creaked as temperatures dropped. Insects grew louder. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thumped intermittently. Ray slept in fragments again, his body locked into the same position, mind hovering just beneath full consciousness. He had been inside the tower for nearly 24 hours. He did not consider leaving. Ray woke fully at 4:26 a.m. when a sharp cramp locked his right thigh. He did not move. He let the pain crest and fade on its own, breathing through his nose, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on a dark section of the tower wall. After nearly a minute, sensation returned in waves, pins and needles, then heat, then the familiar dull ache. He checked the sky through the narrow opening. Still dark. Cloud cover heavy. No moon. He waited. By 5:10 a.m., outlines began to reappear. The paddies emerged first, then the tree lines, then the broken shapes of buildings in the hamlet. Ray blinked repeatedly to clear the grit from his eyes. He did not touch his face. The enemy was different this morning. Movement was minimal. No one lingered in open doorways, no radios visible. They had learned something, but not enough. At 5:43 a.m., a single man crossed a short stretch of open ground carrying a folded map. He moved quickly, almost running, eyes fixed on the dirt in front of him. He disappeared into a different structure and did not re-emerge. Ray did not fire. At 6:09 a.m., 2 men moved together, one trailing the other by several yards. They used walls and shadows carefully, exposing themselves only in brief intervals. Ray tracked them through the scope, noting how their spacing suggested rank. The man in front made decisions. The man behind reacted. When the lead man paused to look back and gesture, Ray fired. The shot sounded different this time. His ears were damaged enough that the report felt distant, like pressure rather than sound. Through the scope, he saw the man stumble and collapse sideways into a shallow ditch. The second man froze, unsure whether to move or hide. Ray watched him retreat slowly, backward, disappearing from view. No immediate reaction followed. That told Ray everything. Command was no longer centralized. By mid-morning, Ray noticed something else. They were no longer searching outward. They were searching randomly. Small groups moved without coordination, checking the same locations multiple times, ignoring others completely. One patrol walked directly beneath the tower again, this time stopping to argue quietly for nearly 5 minutes. Ray felt sweat drip from his hairline and land on the wood near his knee. He did not wipe it away. At 9:17 a.m., a man carrying a radio handset stepped into view near the rear of the hamlet. He spoke briefly, then paused, listening. Ray could not hear the conversation, but he could see frustration in the man's posture. Ray waited until the man shifted his weight forward. The shot dropped him where he stood. The handset remained connected, its wire trailing uselessly across the dirt. This time, panic followed. Men ran without cover. Someone fired wildly into the paddies. Another man fell while trying to drag the body away. Ray did not engage them. Discipline was collapsing on its own. By noon of the second day, American movement on the southern edge of the sector increased noticeably. Patrols advanced farther between halts. Casualty evacuations slowed. Fire support requests decreased. Ray observed all of it from his position, detached but aware. This was working. His body, however, was failing steadily. His lower back burned constantly. His knees felt swollen, unresponsive. When he flexed his fingers, the joints resisted, stiff and sore. He drank his last measured swallow of water at 12:36 p.m. After that, there was none. At 1:22 p.m., another leader appeared briefly to coordinate movement along a tree line. Ray waited longer than usual, forcing himself to remain still despite the growing tremor in his legs. When he fired, the man dropped instantly. The response was muted. No rush, no shouting, just quiet retreat. By late afternoon, the hamlet felt abandoned. Movement occurred only under heavy cover. Orders were relayed face to face, slowly, inefficiently. Time stretched between actions. Time favored Ray's side. As dusk approached, Ray made a decision. He would stay another night. Climbing down now, dehydrated and exhausted, risked noise and exposure. Remaining in place cost him nothing but discomfort. Discomfort was familiar. The second night was worse than the first. Without water, his mouth dried completely. His tongue felt thick and useless. Every breath scraped his throat. Sleep came in. Brief, disorienting fragments, each interrupted by muscle spasms or the sudden fear of falling. At 3:58 a.m., rain began. Light at first, then steady. The sound masked everything. Ray welcomed it. Rain softened movement below, obscured sightlines, and dampened sound. It also cooled the tower slightly, easing the heat trapped in the wood. By dawn of the third day, the sector felt hollow. Movement was minimal. Leadership exposure was almost non-existent. Ray waited nearly 3 hours before seeing a viable target. At 8:14 a.m., a man stepped into the open briefly to direct a small group moving toward the northern edge of the hamlet. He pointed once, sharply, then turned to retreat. Ray fired. The man fell forward and did not move. That was enough. Ray did not fire again that day. He stayed until late afternoon, watching the consequences unfold. Patrols withdrew entirely from several routes. American units advanced with little resistance. The hamlet ceased functioning as a command node. At 5:41 p.m., Ray began his descent. He moved slowly, carefully, testing each rung despite the urgency in his muscles. Halfway down, his legs nearly gave out. He pressed his chest against the ladder and rested, breathing hard, waiting for strength to return. No one noticed. When his boots finally touched the ground, Ray stood still for a full minute, listening. Nothing. He moved away from the tower without looking back. By nightfall, it was once again just another abandoned agricultural structure, unremarkable, ignored, invisible. Ray reached friendly lines just after nightfall. He did not announce himself. He did not seek anyone out. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way men moved when they did not want attention drawn to them. His uniform was stiff with dried sweat and mud. His hands shook slightly when he stopped moving, the delayed response of muscles that had been locked too long. A sentry recognized him and waved him through without comment. Inside the perimeter, the war sounded different. Radios crackled steadily. Men talked at normal volume. Someone laughed briefly. The contrast was jarring. Ray sat down against a sandbag wall and stayed there for nearly 20 minutes before standing again. No one asked where he had been. No one needed to. By the following morning, the change was obvious. Patrols moved farther and faster. Movement across paddies that had been impossible days earlier now happened without contact. Fire support requests dropped sharply. Casualty reports slowed. Enemy resistance had not disappeared. It had lost direction. Ray listened to reports as they came in, piecing together effects he could not see from the tower. Units that had stalled for weeks advanced with minimal opposition. Routes once dominated by ambush became passable again. No one attributed it to a single cause. They rarely did. Ray returned to the same area 2 days later, not to the tower, but to observe from ground level. He watched. American elements passed through the hamlet without incident. Buildings that had once pulsed with activity now stood empty or were occupied only briefly. The enemy had not abandoned the area. They had abandoned leadership within it. That distinction mattered. Over the next 10 days, Ray repeated the process twice more in adjacent sectors. Each time, preparation took longer than execution. He selected different towers, different angles, different distances. He never used the same structure twice. Predictability was the enemy of survival. Each time, the pattern repeated. Initial resistance, sudden losses among decision-makers, confusion, withdrawal. Ray did not count kills. He counted outcomes. Routes reopened. Fire slackened. Men stopped dying in places they had no reason to die. The physical toll accumulated steadily. His knees swelled visibly. His hands lost fine sensation. He developed a persistent ringing in his ears that never fully faded. He slept poorly, even when off the line, his body still expecting immobility. He accepted all of it without comment. Pain was part of the exchange. At no point did Ray request formal authorization. At no point did command issue formal guidance. What he was doing existed in a narrow space between approval and denial. As long as it worked, it was tolerated. As long as it remained unofficial, it was deniable. Others noticed. A sergeant from another unit approached him quietly after a briefing and asked a single question. "How are you getting that angle?" Ray looked at him for several seconds before answering. "Up." That was enough. Within a week, another marksman began operating from an elevated agricultural structure east of Ray's sector. Then another farther south. No one discussed it openly. No orders were written. No maps were marked. The technique spread the way practical knowledge always did. Through observation, through rumor, through men who grew up in similar places, recognizing familiar logic. Engineers eventually visited the area weeks later, long after the immediate effects had already reshaped operations. They climbed abandoned towers. They measured angles. They wrote reports in neutral language that avoided specifics, elevated civilian structures, field expedient positions, potential applications. The reports went upward. They stalled. The war moved on. The front shifted. Attention followed noise and novelty, not quiet effectiveness. Ray remained just another name on a roster. When his tour ended, there was no ceremony, no acknowledgement beyond a handshake and a signature. The towers remained, weathered, ignored, available. What Ray had demonstrated was not brilliance, it was inevitability. In any war fought among civilians, the most powerful positions were often the ones no one thought to classify as positions at all. And the men who understood that best were rarely the ones trained to think like soldiers. The technique did not spread because it was ordered. It spread because it solved a problem no one else had solved. In the weeks that followed Ray's first deployments from the towers, patterns began to appear in after-action reports. Units operating in sectors with elevated sniper activity reported fewer ambushes. Patrols moved with less hesitation. Enemy contact, when it occurred, was shorter and less coordinated. No one connected these outcomes to agricultural structures at first. A staff sergeant from a different battalion noticed something unusual while observing an engagement from a low ridge. He watched a Viet Cong group scatter after a single, precise shot that clearly came from above their line of movement. He scanned trees, rooftops, elevated ground. Then his eyes settled on a rice-drying frame standing alone in the field. He said nothing at the time. 2 days later, he climbed a similar structure during a lull and understood immediately. The view explained everything. He did not ask permission. He did not inform his chain of command. He simply adjusted his routine. Within a month, there were at least 7 marksmen operating from elevated civilian structures across the broader Hughes sector. None of them coordinated directly. None of them shared written guidance. They shared conversations, short ones, private ones, usually late at night. How to climb without noise, how to widen gaps without leaving fresh edges, how to manage water and waste, how to calculate angles without relying on scope adjustments. The men who adapted fastest were those who had grown up rural, farms, ranches, places where height, isolation, and patience were normal parts of work. The enemy noticed effects before they understood causes. Intercepted communications began referencing unseen shooters, elevated fire, attacks with no identifiable origin. Orders were issued advising caution near open terrain, near villages, near any structure that offered height. None of the warnings mentioned towers. They still did not look up. By early April 1968, enemy leadership in several districts began operating under new constraints. Exposure time was minimized. Command was decentralized to the point of inefficiency. Decisions were delayed, second-guessed, or avoided entirely. The war slowed down in those areas. For American units, that slowdown meant survival. Engineering officers were eventually tasked with examining several of the positions after hearing repeated, unconnected reports. They climbed towers, they measured angles, they noted the thickness of beams and the way structures absorbed recoil. Their findings were cautious. The structures were effective. They were dangerous to occupy. They required discipline and experience. No recommendation was made to standardize the technique. The report moved upward and stalled. There were always louder problems to address. When training manuals were updated later, the language was vague. Elevated civilian structures were mentioned in passing as potential observation or firing positions in rural environments. No examples were given, no credit assigned. Doctrine absorbed the idea without acknowledging its origin. Ray never pushed for recognition. He returned to duty like any other marksman, rotated sectors, completed his tour, and left Vietnam quietly. The ringing in his ears stayed. The stiffness in his knees worsened. He adapted. When he returned home, he went back to work. The farm had changed while he was gone. New fences, new equipment, same land, same routines. He did not talk about the war. When asked, he said he had done his job. Years later, a historian attempted to track down the origins of elevated sniper positions used in Vietnam. The paper trail was thin. Names were missing. Reports contradicted one another. Ray declined an interview. He had no interest in explaining something that had never felt extraordinary to him. To Ray, the logic was simple. If you wanted to see clearly, you climbed. If you wanted to be ignored, you used what everyone else dismissed. If you wanted to survive, you waited. The towers still stand in places across Vietnam. Most are collapsing now, their purpose long forgotten, their boards rotting under rain and sun. They look like nothing, which is exactly why they worked. He lived another 40 years without ever seeing a tower the same way again. Back home, when he climbed a ladder to repair a beam or clear a blockage, the motion felt familiar in ways he never explained. Height no longer meant risk to him. It meant clarity. It meant time. It meant control over when something happened, not whether it happened at all. The war followed him only in small ways. A stiffness in the knees on cold mornings, a constant low ringing that never fully faded, a tendency to sit still longer than most people were comfortable with. He married. He worked. He kept routines simple. When Vietnam was discussed in public, he listened and said nothing. When men argued about tactics or politics, he stayed quiet. He had learned that most people talked about war as if it were noise. To him, it had always been silence punctuated by brief, decisive moments. The towers never appeared in official histories. They did not fit clean narratives. They did not involve new technology. They could not be photographed easily or demonstrated on training grounds. They belonged to a category the military rarely celebrated. Solutions that worked because someone ignored convention rather than refined it. Years later, younger soldiers would talk about elevation, unconventional firing positions, and using civilian structures in asymmetric warfare. They would speak as if these ideas had emerged gradually, organically, without origin. That was mostly true. Ideas like that rarely had a single inventor. They surfaced when conditions allowed them to, carried forward by people who recognized usefulness rather than authorship. Ray understood that. He never expected acknowledgement. He never asked for it. What mattered to him was simpler. Men who would have died did not. Movements that had stalled resumed. Chaos replaced control where control had once cost lives. That was enough. In the end, nothing marked what he had done. No plaque, no citation, no footnote with his name attached. Only a quiet shift in how people thought about space, patience, and the value of places no one bothered to consider. The war moved on. Doctrine evolved. The towers decayed. And somewhere between all of it, an idea born far from any battlefield did exactly what it needed to do, then disappeared, which was always its nature.